everybody. Welcome to the Tournament Center here at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch. I'm Brian David Marshall. I am joined by Pro Tour Hall of Famer Brian Kibler. Brian, 20 years ago, it was possible to qualify for a Pro Tour by dialing in.
It was a little easier, especially if you were playing in the junior division like me. They actually had extra spots. So you probably could have called the week before and be like, hey, my kid wants to play. So it was a little different back then.
Not only could you qualify by dialing in, but there was this thing called a busy signal, which I'm sure some people out there have never experienced.
Seriously.
So tell us a little bit about the constructed format for this Pro Tour. It was a unique standard format created just for this tournament, and it wasn't called standard back then. It was just called Type 2.
And for the first Pro Tour, you had to use 5 cards from each of the sets that were legal in Type 2. And I think that had to do with the fact they wanted to highlight some of the new sets. And the most recent set was Homelands, which if you didn't make people play cards from Homelands, they probably weren't going to do it. So deck building was very weird for the format, because it was like, okay, not only do you have to figure out what do I want in my deck, what do I want against decks that people might play, you have to also squeeze in cards from each of the sets in there. So a little weird.
Were you already fascinated with deck construction at that stage of your Magic career?
Yeah, I mean, I actually remember there were books written by George Baxter.
Who top-aided that event?
Yeah, he top-aided that Pro Tour. It definitely, I'm sure, helped his book sales out. But I remember going through these books and seeing that sort of the theory they had, what they're talking about. And all of my notebooks in high school were just full of deck lists. No notes for class, just deck lists.
So it was 4th edition, Chronicles, Ice Age, Homelands, Fallen Empires?
Yes, yeah.
5 cards, you have to play at least 5 cards from each. So where did that take you in terms of what you wanted to do?
I mean, I was basically just trying to figure out a deck. I'm a 15-year-old kid. There weren't really the resources, anything close to the resources that are available now.
Sure.
There were no Magic websites really. There was the Magic Dojo that began after the first Pro Tour,
right,
if my recollection is correct.
Right.
Or at least in that
Yeah, we didn't use
frame.
news groups.
There were BBS rec.games.magic or whatever was where you'd find the latest tech.
As close as you can get to that actual address tells you how often we used it back then.
I was a regular there.
So let's take a look a little bit at some of the cards in your deck. So you had 14 creatures in your deck.
Yep.
Talk about Abyssal Spectre and some of the other cards you played with.
So technology in Magic has come a long way since '96. Basically, my deck was a discard deck. It was focused on playing fast creatures, most notably Hypnotic Spectre, which was totally busted.
Yeah.
Especially when you could play with Dark Ritual. You could play turn 1 Dark Ritual Hypnotic Spectre. If your opponent didn't kill it immediately, good chance you just rip their hand apart. So Order the Ebb in Hand from Fallen Empires helps satisfy that requirement.
Dang.
And it's also just an efficient creature. It's a 2/1 for 2. Also very good against white decks because there's protection from white, and you can first strike pump it as well.
So Sengir Vampire, of course, everyone remembers opening a Sengir Vampire.
I mean, you could double Dark Ritual Sengir Vampire. How could anyone ever beat that?
All right, let's take a look at some of the spells that are in the deck. There we've highlighted the rack. You talked about this being a discard deck.
Yeah, I mean, the focus of the deck was clearly to sort of empty the opponent's hand, both to disrupt them, generally speaking, as well as to deal damage to them with the rack. And you can see, 4 Hymn to Torak, 4 Bolt, 4 Incinerate. So I knew what good removal spells were, even back 20 years ago when I was 15. But I might not have quite figured out the sort of cards you want to play in different types of deck, like Zuranorb, Felden's Cane. Those are restricted cards, that's why there's one of them. But probably didn't need to be in my aggressive black-red deck at the time. And then Balance was the one non-black or red card.
I was just going to ask you.
I could only cast it off of my 4 Cities of Brass. But if you balance someone to 0 cards with racks in play, they're not going to win, especially if you Zuranorb away all your land.
Yeah, no, that's true. Zuranorb Balance was a tricky little game.
And the rules were different back then.
Yeah.
You could cast Balance, and your opponent had to tell you if they were going to counterspell it, because there was the interrupt window, and then you're like, okay, no counterspells? All right, sack it all Zuranorb. Very different world back then.
So now, I mean, the black-red, there were Necro decks.
Yeah.
The Necro won the juniors division of the Pro Tour. Was Necro a card you weren't aware of? I mean, you have a lot of the elements.
It was, actually. I was playing this deck with Necropotence in my deck briefly. I mean, when I say playing, I was in high school at the time. There was maybe a couple local tournaments I played in. There wasn't a really big competitive circuit at all like there is today. I don't even know if Apprentice existed back then, one of the sort of things you could play online. There certainly was no Magic Online. But I actually cut Necropotence from my deck because I had to play Chronicles cards and I was playing City of Brass.
Let's take a look at the
lands. And I did
lands.
way too much damage to myself.
Yeah, if we look at the land, you'll see the 4 cities of brass.
Yeah, 4 City of Brass, and then Sulphurous Springs. You know, we've come a long way in Painlands too, as well as just understanding how mana works. It's like I had, you know, 23 land or something like that, and five of them were colorless. So I probably was, you know, mana screwed, color skewed here and there. But I mean, Mistress Factory and Strip Mine, both great cards. Strip Mine, of course, restricted as well. But Dark Ritual let you play some of the bigger things, you know, out faster despite not having as many lands.
How did you count that as like half a land?
I didn't really do count. I just had check marks in my, you know, in my my notebook. It's like, okay, these are where the land goes, and ditto mark, ditto mark.
So let's take a look at the sideboard, because the sideboard was a great resource for hitting the magic number 5 in a lot of the categories.
There are a couple things to note about this sideboard. One is all of my Homelands cards are here, which included Ishan Shade, Anzarin Ruins, which I guess maybe if I played against a Goblin deck could come in handy. That taps all creatures of a type and they can't untap. And then Apocalypse Chime, which kills all Homelands cards, just in case anyone was playing Autumn Willow or just a lot of Homelands cards for some reason.
Do you remember siding in Apocalypse
No, it never
Chime at all?
happened. It never happened.
Okay.
So, but I think one of the best parts about this sideboard is it's really 1996 sideboarding technology. It's just nothing but color hate cards. I have Anarchy. I really didn't want to lose to a white deck, apparently. I had a bunch of pro-white creatures, Anarchy, Gloom, and Ishan Shade. And then, you know, if I play against a green deck, I got these Death Grips. Blue deck, I got these Red Elemental Blasts. So, you know, we're a little more subtle these days in terms of both the kinds of hate cards that exist, as well as, you know, the sideboards that we build.
What do you remember about playing in that tournament with this deck?
I mean, most of my opponents didn't really necessarily have like cohesive decks. You know, my deck was much better sort of tuned, I would say, than a lot of my opponents. Many of my opponents were, you know, younger than me. They were, you know, 13, 14. I did actually play against a number of players who would go on to, you know, have some Pro Tour success at that tournament. It's interesting, the junior division of that tournament did have a lot of players who you know, later had a lot of success. Mike Bergoli was a player who has several top 8s who I played in that tournament. Dan Burdick as well. He's a player who was very successful early in the sort of days of competitive Magic. And
brother of Matt Place.
Yeah. And you know, like I think they ended the first day and we had to come back and play like 1 round in the second day. And I think like maybe it was 2 rounds, but one of my opponents didn't show up for the second day because it was so snowy or something like that.
It was pretty snowy.
It really was. But yeah, it was an interesting experience.
And 20 years later, you're still here doing it. Could you have ever imagined that at the time?
I mean, I got 30th place in the junior division of the first Pro Tour, which qualified me for the second Pro Tour in LA, which was Booster Draft, which I'd never heard of. So I was like, I'm not going to fly across the country. I'm 15 and a freshman in high school to go play in this tournament in this format I've never even heard of, and then found myself trying to requalify through whatever means, you know, 6 months, a year later, and then eventually made it back.
All right, well, and it all worked out. Hall of Famer Brian Kibler here talking to us about his Pro Tour 1 deck from 20 years ago from the Tournament Center here at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch.
That was fun.